Have you ever heard of a government actively deceiving its own citizens? By the end of this video, you'll understand the tricks a government might use to deceive its people. When does your government betray you? It's a strange question. Normally, a modern government wouldn't betray its own people. Doing so would harm its credibility and increase the cost of governance. Without sufficient benefit, there is usually no reason for a government to do such a thing. The exceptions are cases where a small group of officials act in their own interest, harming some citizens.
Stupid government!
For instance, from 1932 to 1972, there was the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment in the United States. For 40 years, the Public Health Service, in collaboration with Tuskegee University, deceived 600 black men into participating in the syphilis experiment, which eventually led to 128 deaths, 40 infected wives, and 19 children born with congenital syphilis. But is there an instance where the highest level of government directly led a scheme that harmed all its citizens? Rare, but it has happened. Today, we'll talk about a massive scam orchestrated by the ruler and finance minister, which fooled the entire nation while the people unknowingly rushed into the trap. This country was France in 1716. At this time, France was indeed facing a major crisis, a debt crisis. If you've seen my previous videos, you might already be wary when you hear debt. Yes, like the Chinese nationalist government in 1948 and the Weimar government in Germany in 1921, France had enormous war debts. France owned 2 billion livres, a currency backed by precious metals like gold and silver. But its annual revenue was only 69 million livres, while expenditure were as high as 146 million, putting the country on the brink of bankruptcy. The previous king, Louis XIV, fought so many wars, racked up so much debt, and then left to meet God. Louis XV, who succeeded him, was only 5 years old, so the regent, Duke of Orleans, took over running the government. The Duke of Orleans was left to deal with the mess, and his main task was to solve France's massive debt problem. France was like a big ship with a gaping hole in the bottom, about to sink. The Duke brought in all the ship's repairmen, but none could fix it. Suddenly, a man claiming to be a magician showed up, saying he could save the ship. With no better options, the Duke let him try. This magician is the protagonist of today's story, John Law. His life story is very similar to that of China's famous Asian reformer Shang Yang. After telling John Law's story, we'll compare the two. John Law was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, into a banking family. He had great talent for math from a young age, but he used it not in academics, but in gambling. His precise calculations made him a lot of money through gambling, which he then spent lavishly on women. One day, he dueled with a rival over a noble woman, killed him, and had to flee to Amsterdam to avoid being arrested by the British authorities. In Amsterdam, John Law was deeply impressed by its prosperity. After some observations, he came to some rather backwards conclusions. He believed that a country's prosperity depended on the amount of currency in the circulation. The more, the better for trade. He thought that as trade grew, so would the need for money, meaning inflation wouldn't worsen simply from printing more money. He also believed that banks should lower interest rates and lend out this newly issued money to promote trade and employment, leading to further national prosperity. He wrote down his ideas in a book called Money and Trade Considered, with the proposal for supplying the nation with money. 10 years after the British warrant for his arrest expired, he returned to Britain to try to sell his ideas to the government. If you've seen my previous two videos, you would instantly see the flaws in his theory. Money must be backed by something of value to enter the market, or else printing too much currency would inevitably cause severe inflation. However, his theory did match the economic activities of the time. Why was that? Back then, Western nations had colonized the Americas. They brought slaves from Africa to the Americas to produce sugar, cotton, tobacco, rum, and other goods, which were then sold to Europe. Europe also traded goods to the American colonies. As a result, for Western European countries, there was a constant influx of products from overseas. These transactions needed a large amount of currency, so John Law's theory seemed to fit the economic reality of the time. The problem was that John Law took what he observed at a specific moment and turned it into a conclusion that he believed applied in all situations, which was clearly wrong. It's like seeing Warren Buffett eat McDonald's and drive a used car, then concluding that eating McDonald's and driving an old car is the key to becoming a billionaire investor. John Law overlooked the fundamental point. It's not money that creates wealth, but production and labor that create products, which then creates the need for trade, leading to demand for a medium of exchange, money. For over 10 years, Law went around Europe trying to promote his ideas, but no one paid much attention until he met the Duke of Orleans, who had inherited the mess in France. The Duke heard that John Law could not only solve France's debt problem but also bring prosperity, so he immediately allowed Law to carry out reforms. However, since Law had no prior experience, the Duke only gave him 6 million livres to test his ideas. Law used this money to open a bank, which was authorized to issue banknotes that could be exchanged for coins at face value. At the time, French coins were losing value because the government was reducing the amount of gold and silver in them. If people could exchange these devalued coins for lost banknotes at the same value, they were naturally willing to use paper money. Law also guaranteed that people could exchange the banknotes for coins at any time. Eventually, paying taxes and transferring money between provinces had to be done with paper money. Soon, people began to trust the banknotes and got used to using them in transactions. If you've heard the story of Shangyang that I previously talked about, you might recall that before implementing his reforms, Shangyang established trust among the people with the Move the Log for Credibility event, which made his reforms easier to carry out. Similarly, John Law established trust in his banknotes to make them widely accepted. Once people were using paper money extensively, they wouldn't actually go to the bank to exchange it for coins. This allowed the Duke of Orleans and John Law to move on to their next step. What was the next step? Quite simply, to solve France's huge debt problem. As a big believer in paper money, John Law's solution was, of course, to print a massive amount of banknotes. But flooding the market with paper money in a short period would inevitably cause severe inflation. Once the value of the banknotes dropped, people would rush to exchange them for coins. And Law's bank simply wouldn't have enough coins to cover the demand. The result would be the collapse of the entire financial system. So, there was still a key step between getting people used to paper money and solving the debt problem. John Law needed to find something to back the value of these banknotes. That something was shares in the Mississippi Company. In the early 18th century, France had a large, undeveloped colony in North America's Mississippi River Valley called Louisiana. It covered an area about the size of 10 modern U.S. states in the Midwest. John Law founded a state-owned company, the Mississippi Company, that, with the support of the Duke of Orleans, was granted monopoly rights over the colony's development and trade. They used the media to hype the value of the colony, claiming it had vast amounts of gold, abundant fur, fertile land, and friendly natives. Since the Mississippi Company was the only one allowed to develop this land, its stock price began to soar. Of course, you might wonder, people weren't fooled back then. Even if communication was slow, eventually someone would return from Louisiana and tell everyone it was just difficult to develop jungle and swamp. Wouldn't the stock price then fall? No problem. What you thought of, John Law thought of too. His solution was to keep expanding the company's operations, and each new business gave a reason for the stock price to rise again. With support from the Duke of Orleans, in September 1718, the Mississippi Company got the exclusive right to the tobacco trade. In November, it gained the right to all African trade. Later, it merged with other companies and gained the right to trade in Asia. As the Mississippi Company's stock price skyrocketed again and again, people went mad with excitement. To get the right to subscribe to the stock, people in France did everything they could to get close to John Law. Houses around his residence were fiercely competed over, just so people could be near the finance chief of France. Rents for those houses increased 16 times. A cobbler on the street made 200 livres a day just by renting out his stall and providing writing materials to people wanting to buy stock. One noblewoman wanted to meet John Law so badly that she had her coach driven around for 3 days until she finally saw his carriage. She then ordered her coachman to crash into a lamppost, causing her to scream and fall out. Out of sympathy, John Law got down to help her, and that's how she made contact with him and eventually got the right to buy stock. The value of the Mississippi Company was successfully hyped up. So how could the government debt be resolved next? John Law came up with a brilliant idea. People could exchange government bonds for stock. Bonds were proof that the government owed money to the people, and as long as the government wanted to rule the country and maintain its credibility, it had to pay back the bondholders when the bonds matured. But if the bonds were exchanged for stock and the stock price crashed, people might end up with nothing. However, with stock price soaring, people were too blinded by greed to worry about the risk. Everyone wanted to exchange their bonds for stock. In this way, the government debt problem was greatly alleviated, and the Mississippi Company collected a large amount of banknotes from the market through its stock. Why do I use the word collected? Because I want to emphasize that these banknotes were issued by John Law on behalf of the French government. The Banque Royale, run by John Law, issued paper money, which was then collected by selling stock, effectively allowing the government to print a huge amount of wealth for itself, legally. People thought they were exchanging their banknotes for more valuable stock, but in reality, the Mississippi Company was not nearly as profitable as it was claimed to be. And instead of investing the collected banknotes into developing the Louisiana colony, the Mississippi Company lent the money to the government at a very low interest rate to pay off higher interest debt. Did you notice that in this game, John Law's Banque Royale and the Mississippi Company were like his left and right hands? In fact, both the headquarters of the Banque Royale and the Mississippi Company were in the same place, the Palais Mazarin. If the stock price of the Mississippi Company fell, John Law would have the Bank Royale print more banknotes, which people would use to buy stock, causing the stock price to rise. When there was too much paper money in circulation, John Law would have the Mississippi Company issue new shares, and people would spend their money on these new shares, thus controlling the amount of money in circulation. By reducing France's massive debt and driving up the value of Mississippi Company stock, John Law became the most powerful and popular person in France. But just 2 years later, he was driven out of France and eventually died poor in Venice. Why did this happen? Due to time constraints, we'll stop here for now. In the next episode, I'll review how John Law ended up ruining the financial system he designed. If you have any suggestions or comments, please leave them down below. See you next time!